Hello, and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. What's the deal with where was God? Now, this is a atheistic objection or argument that I've heard, and I'll address it for you. I call the argument the where was God argument. Now, the argument goes like this. Um, if God created the universe, then God must have pre-existed the universe. Okay. Um, So, where was God before the universe was created? And if God is eternal, and there was an infinite regression of time prior to the creation of the universe, then how is it that God ever came to the moment in time that He created our universe? Are you saying He spent an infinite amount of time prior to creating our universe? Well, that would seem to be impossible. If there was a prior infinite amount of time to the creation of our universe, then there would always be a time prior to the creation of the universe through which God had not yet traversed. So, how would He ever come to the moment in time when He could create the universe? So, this is um, sort of using the beginningless time paradox against theism or against God by saying that, well, if there was an infinite amount of time prior to the creation of the universe, God would never have come to the time or the moment in time in which He could have created the universe. Therefore, God doesn't exist. So, this atheistic objection really is, where was God prior to the creation of the universe? Where was He hanging out? Where was He residing? And how is it that God could exist for an infinite amount of time prior to creating the universe? Another argument would be, well, if the universe, God hadn't created the universe yet, well, where was He? Where was He residing? Where was He hanging out? Well, He must have had some other place, some other created place that He could reside in. But if He created that place, well, then there must have been some place prior to that which He also created, which He could reside in. And if He's eternal or infinitely old, then He must have always had some place to reside in. And that would mean you'd have an infinite regression of created places because God has to reside somewhere. Well, the atheist will argue, well, if you have an infinite number of prior created places, what do you need God for? If that's true, then the atheist would argue God is an extra assumption that you don't need under Occam's razor. And it's more reasonable to believe that created places or universes have always existed than to believe that they've always existed and there was a God, because there doesn't seem to be a need for a God if that's true, that places have always existed. So these can be some very compelling arguments against the existence of God if you don't understand God. And I'm going to show you what's wrong with these arguments and how to get out. Uh, the thing to understand about God is timeless. God is not subject to time. God is the metaphysical cause of time. He is not subject to time. God does not experience time. Uh, God created time, and God cannot be subject to that which God creates. If He was, then He would be self created, because if the thing necessary for Himself to exist, time, is something He Himself created, well, then His creation would be responsible for His own existence. That's self creation. That's impossible. Self creation is impossible because the thing you need to create can't exist prior to its creation in order to allow the creator to exist. So self-creation is impossible. And God is outside of time or not subject to time because God creates time. God can't be subject to time. So that's the key to getting out of all these arguments. So God is timeless. So whenever an atheist or a non-believer asks a temporal question about God, watch out, because you got to remember that those questions make no sense in terms of God, because God is not subject to time. God does not have an age. God is not infinitely old. God doesn't have an age. To have an age, you have to be subject to time. God is not subject to time. God does not reside in a created place. So it's very much true that God is not subject to time and has no age. So questions like, well, isn't God older than the universe? That presumes that God has an age. God doesn't have an age. A newborn baby is older than God. Now, that may sound weird, but that's only because God doesn't have an age. God is not subject to time. Temporal questions are not applicable to God. So, questions about where was God before the universe was created? Where? He wasn't anywhere. God is a metaphysical, uncaused being. He doesn't have to reside in a created place. In fact, he can't. He's an uncaused being. He's not made of parts. A being that's not made of parts can't be subject to time because parts are only good if they move. And movement requires time. So anything that's made of parts is subject to time. God is uncaused. That means God was not created. But that also means that God is not made of parts. Because if he was, then he would be created by those parts. And because they're parts and they move, because all parts move, then that would mean he was also subject to time. So God being uncaused is not made of parts, but also he cannot be subject to time either. Uh, so, uh, where was God before the universe was created? He wasn't anywhere. God does not require a created material reality for God to exist. Uh, so there is no infinite series of regressive created places because God doesn't require a created place in order to exist or be real. So you can knock out the atheist's Occam's razor argument that God is an unnecessary assumption because there were not an infinite number of uh, prior created places. And the reason for this is because time had to have a beginning. And I did a video on the beginning of this time paradox that will prove that to you. Um, so, was there an infinite amount of time God was hanging out prior to the creation of the universe? No, there wasn't, because of the beginningless time paradox and because God is not subject to time. That is a nonsensical, meaningless question about God. We call these meaningless questions non sequiturs. So don't get confused by these where was God sort of questions. They seem appealing on their face that, hey, the atheist has a point here. Uh, but that's only because you don't understand God and who God truly is. God is a timeless being, not subject to time. God is the creator of time. God doesn't have an age. God is not infinitely old. God doesn't have an age. A newborn baby is older than God. And I know that sounds weird, but it's also true because God doesn't have an age. So you can avoid all these questions by simply pointing out that God is not subject to time, or you could say God is outside of time. And these questions are temporal questions that you're asking about God, which are not applicable to a being that creates time. You can't ask a question about God and time when God is the person who creates time. Um, I like to phrase it as God is not subject to time as opposed to God is outside of time. And the reason is because the word outside is a little ambiguous, because when you use words like outside, then some people think, well, there must have been some other place where God was outside of our universe or our reality. And if he's in another place, a created place, then he's subject to time. So I don't like to use the word outside. A lot of people do. So long as you have the proper understanding that outside of time means not subject to time. You don't have an age, you're not subject to time. So these questions can be easily dismissed, but you have to remember God is not subject to time. God is the creator of time. God does not need to reside in time or in a created place that is subject to time. Now, these are some profound things about God, but God is the uncaused metaphysical cause of material reality, and that's a very profound concept. Uh, and But it's what you need to get out of these sorts of arguments. All right, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Please press the subscribe button. I appreciate it. And Don't get rattled by these questions because they're really just they're really there to just test your understanding of God in terms of metaphysics. And most people don't understand metaphysics, and they don't understand these details that I'm giving you about God, so they can easily get trapped by these sort of temporal questions about God easily, because they haven't studied these sorts of details about the metaphysics of God. But you need to know that, though. You need to know these details in order to get out of these objections. All right. Hope you learned something. Take care.